The wind howled as Father Elias stared down the desolate highway that stretched infinitely into the dark. Moonlight bathed the broken asphalt, casting long, crooked shadows across the road. The air felt damp, suffused with the earthy scent of fog settling thick over the land. The place was silent, empty of sound or life. Elias had been summoned here before dawn, yet the oppressive quiet made it feel as though time had stopped, or perhaps never existed at all. Father Elias had seen death. As a young man, he served in the heart of brutal conflict. He was a survivor of 2 wars, both in distant, unyielding lands and here at home against forces of the unseen. The experiences left him with knowledge that most couldn't comprehend. The dead haunted him in memories and, often enough, in flesh. As the town's most experienced exorcist, he was called on for cases that were beyond the reach of the ordinary priest. And now, the town of Briarwood had sent for him, pleading for help against the dark roads, the crossroads that had claimed so many. Elias had heard rumors. Many drivers had vanished without a trace while passing through the fog, only for their cars to be found later, abandoned and rusted, as if they'd been lying there for decades. The most recent case, however, was especially disturbing. A mother and her daughter had been found dead just days ago, mouths frozen in silent screams, their bodies untouched but for the signs of something unholy that had left its mark on their eyes. Empty, sunken, and black as coal. As he took his first steps toward the intersection, Elias felt the ground beneath him grow colder, a sensation he'd long come to recognize as the presence of something ancient and unnatural. He murmured a silent prayer and took out his old leather-bound Bible, well worn from years of battle with forces beyond the living world. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, guttural whisper. Elias halted, ears straining against the silence, his gaze darting to the shadows that seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of his vision. Father Elias. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but filled with malice. It seeped into his bones, tightening his muscles, setting every nerve on alert. Father Elias adjusted his grip on the Bible, his fingers brushing over the marks that years of battle had left on its cover. His flashlight flickered as he turned it toward the crossroads, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock him, twisting and dancing along the road. As he moved closer to the center of the intersection, the mist thickened, and the air grew colder, pulling the breath from his lungs in shallow puffs of fog. The darkness seemed to press in on him, as if it had a weight of its own. He felt eyes upon him, an eerie sensation that crept down his spine. Yet he saw nothing but his own shadow, stretching across the road. Just then, a figure appeared on the edge of the fog. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, her dress tattered and stained with mud. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with wide, hollow eyes that stared at him, unblinking. "Elias, Elias." Her voice echoed around him, fading in and out like a radio signal. "They're waiting." The girl's face twisted into a grotesque smile, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Elias whispered a prayer, clenching his jaw against the wave of nausea that threatened to overtake him. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "They're waiting for you, Elias," she repeated, tilting her head as her smile faded. "They know you." As the words left her lips, the fog thickened, swallowing her whole. Elias stepped back, gripping his Bible tightly, the pages fluttering as an unseen wind blew through the intersection. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. He staggered, feeling a pulse, a heartbeat from the earth itself. The air filled with a low hum, building into a maddening rhythm that echoed through his skull. Then came the laughter, soft at first but growing louder, a sick chorus of voices overlapping until it filled the space around him. "They know you," the voices chanted. "You brought them death. You brought them silence." Elias steadied himself, breathing deeply as the voices grew louder, seeming to close in around him. He reached for the flask in his pocket, a relic from his days on the battlefield. With a practiced motion, he took a swig, letting the burn ground him in the present. "You won't frighten me," he muttered, flipping through the pages of his Bible until he found the verse he sought. He began to read, his voice firm and unwavering, even as the laughter grew louder. But as he spoke, The fog parted, and through it, a new figure emerged, an old friend. A man he had once known well, standing as solid as the earth beneath him. Elias's breath caught. "Murphy?" Elias whispered, unable to believe what he saw. Sergeant Murphy had died beside him in the trenches all those years ago. Murphy's eyes were hollow, his skin waxy and pale, as though he'd been dredged from the depths of a river. He took a step forward, lifting a hand as if to reach out to Elias. "You left us, Eli," he whispered, voice carrying the weight of the grave. "You let us die." Elias felt his stomach drop, memories flashing through his mind. Murphy and the others, his squad had been ambushed, left behind when Elias had barely managed to escape. He had lived with their faces haunting him ever since. "No," Elias said, shaking his head. I tried to save you." But Murphy's expression remained impassive, accusing. "You let me die, Elias, and now you're going to stay here with us." His voice twisted, growing deeper, darker, laced with rage. As Murphy spoke, the fog coalesced around him, thickening until the entire area seemed to pulse with shadow. From the corners of his vision, Elias saw more figures emerging from the mist. Familiar faces from the war, men he had seen fall in battle, all with the same hollow eyes and accusing glares. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. The figures closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, a mockery of the life they once had. Elias took a deep breath and planted his feet. He had dealt with spirits before, but nothing of this magnitude, nothing with such personal ties. He knew these weren't really his friends. They were shadows twisted by the dark force inhabiting this place, yet the pain and anger they radiated felt real. He opened his Bible, holding it out in front of him as he began to chant an exorcism prayer, his voice cutting through the dense fog. "Lord, deliver us from evil," he began, his voice carrying over the moans of the spirits. From the snares of the devil, from death and from despair. The ground shook as he spoke, the fog swirling, retreating as if recoiling from his words. The spirits stopped, their faces contorted in pain as the prayer began to take hold. For a moment, Elias thought he could see a flicker of humanity in their eyes, as if they were waking from a nightmare. But then the laughter returned, a single deep voice echoing through the darkness, louder and more menacing than before. "You think your words can save you, priest?" The voice boomed, vibrating through the ground beneath him. "You have no power here." A figure emerged from the shadows, towering over the other spirits. Dressed in a long, tattered cloak, its face hidden beneath a hood, it radiated an aura of pure malice. Elias could feel the weight of its gaze, a darkness so ancient and so cold that it threatened to snuff out his very soul. "I am the keeper of the crossroads," the figure intoned, its voice like gravel. "I hold dominion over the dead who wander here, and you, priest, are no exception." Elias's hands trembled, but he tightened his grip on the Bible, meeting the figure's gaze with unwavering determination. "In the name of God, I command you to release these souls," Elias said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "They are not yours to keep." The figure chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "You claim to know these souls, but it was you who abandoned them, priest. They belong to me now." With a wave of its hand, the figure sent a wave of darkness crashing toward Elias, who staggered back as the force hit him like a physical blow. He gasped, struggling to breathe as the weight of the shadows pressed down on him, threatening to smother him. "Submit, and I will let you join them in peace," the figure whispered, its voice curling around him like smoke. "Resist, and you will suffer endlessly." Elias forced himself to his knees, clutching the Bible as he began to recite the prayer again. Each word a lifeline as he fought against the pull of the darkness. His voice was hoarse, but he pressed on, refusing to give in. The ground beneath him trembled as the spirits around him began to wail, their voices joining his in a chaotic symphony of anguish and prayer. The fog seemed to pulse with each word, retreating in waves as the figure hissed in anger. "You cannot win, Elias," it growled, its voice distorted, echoing from every direction. "This place is mine." With a final burst of strength, Elias raised the Bible, shouting the last words of the exorcism with all the power he could muster. A blinding light burst forth from the Bible, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The spirits shrieked, their forms dissipating as the light washed over them, freeing them from the grip of the dark entity. The figure screamed, recoiling as the light seared through its cloak, revealing a face twisted in rage and agony, a visage of pure malevolence. It stumbled back, its form flickering, unraveling as the power of the prayer tore through it. "No," it howled, its voice growing weaker. "This is my domain, my kingdom." Elias took a step forward, holding the Bible out in front of him as he continued the prayer. His voice unwavering. The figure shrieked, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke, scattering into the wind as the light swallowed it whole. When the last echo of its scream faded, the fog lifted, revealing the road as it truly was, empty, quiet, and still. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders as the darkness finally receded. The souls of his fallen comrades were gone, their suffering finally put to rest. He knew he'd never see them again, but he felt a sense of peace, knowing they were free. He turned and walked back to his car, the Bible clutched tightly in his hands. The darkness had been vanquished, but he knew that the scars of this battle would stay with him forever. As he drove away from the crossroads, he cast one last look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowed figure lingering there. But there was nothing, only the empty road stretching out behind him, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Father Elias gripped the wheel, his knuckles white as the remnants of the night's battle washed over him. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the confrontation was gone, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The road stretched out behind him, barren and silent, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. The air inside his car was stifling, laced with the faint metallic tang of blood, a smell he thought he'd left behind on the battlefields. Glancing at the Bible resting on the passenger seat, he noted that it still radiated a faint warmth, as if the power he'd summoned had yet to completely dissipate. It reassured him, though he wasn't entirely convinced that the battle was over. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when he finally reached the edge of Briarwood, where a handful of townspeople had gathered in uneasy silence, their eyes wide with apprehension. Word had spread quickly, and the townsfolk were curious to see the exorcist return from the dark roads. They watched him, a mixture of awe and fear in their expressions, and Elias felt the weight of their gazes as he stepped out of the car. An elderly woman, stooped with age, approached him cautiously. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Father, did you see them? Those who have gone missing?" Elias took a moment before answering. He didn't want to recount the details, the faces, the accusations, the smell of rotten death that had clung to him. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "They're at peace now," he said simply, hoping it would bring her some comfort. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some bowed their heads, whispering prayers of gratitude, while others exchanged glances, as if uncertain whether they could truly believe him. But before he could turn back to his car, a younger man stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. His gaze was sharp, desperate, as though he'd been holding on to hope for far too long. "My sister disappeared there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Her car was found, but she wasn't. Did you see her?" Elias looked down, feeling the weight of the man's grief press into him. The spirits he'd encountered had been twisted beyond recognition, stripped of their humanity by the darkness that had claimed them. He couldn't say for certain if the young man's sister had been among them. "I didn't see her," he said gently, "but I did all I could to release the spirits that were bound there. She's free now." The man's shoulders sagged, and he offered a quiet, "Thank you," before stepping back into the crowd, his expression unreadable. As Elias turned to leave, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from a distance. He turned his gaze toward the outskirts of the town, where the fog was already beginning to gather again, thick and ominous, swallowing the dark roads whole. Despite the exorcism, the darkness seemed reluctant to let go of its claim on the land. Elias returned to the small rectory where he'd been staying, hoping to rest and regain his strength. But as he lay on his narrow cot, sleep eluded him. Each time he closed his eyes, the faces of the lost stared back at him, hollow-eyed and accusing. It was as if the darkness had left a mark on him, something beyond his reach that he couldn't shake. That night, he was jolted awake by a strange sound, a faint scratching coming from outside his window. He sat up, his heart pounding as he listened, straining to make sense of the noise. But the rectory was silent once more, the only sound his own ragged breathing. With a feeling of dread, he rose from the bed and crossed the room, opening the window just a crack to peer outside. The night was thick with mist, swirling in dense tendrils that seemed to beckon him. He could barely make out the trees on the edge of the churchyard, their branches twisting in the shadows. Just as he was about to close the window, he saw it, a faint figure standing among the trees, its form hazy and indistinct, like a shadow caught between worlds. It took a step forward, and Elias felt his blood run cold as he recognized the face. It was Murphy. Elias's throat tightened. He had released Murphy's spirit, he was certain of it. But here he was, standing in the darkness, his eyes hollow and filled with an unspeakable sorrow. "Why are you here?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. Murphy's gaze met his, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. But then his expression darkened, and he lifted his hand, pointing directly at Elias. "You left me," he whispered, his voice carrying across the night like a cold wind. "You let me die." Elias stumbled back, slamming the window shut as his hands shook. He backed away, clutching the cross around his neck as he whispered a prayer, his heart pounding. The scratching began again, louder this time, more insistent. It was as if something was trying to claw its way inside, scratching at the very walls of the rectory. Elias pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily. He knew he'd completed the exorcism. He had freed the souls from the crossroads. But something was wrong, something he couldn't quite understand. It was as if a part of the darkness had followed him, attaching itself to his very soul. The scratching continued through the night, relentless and unyielding, echoing through the halls like a sinister chant. By dawn, Elias was pale and exhausted, his mind clouded with shadows he couldn't shake. The events of the past night had left him shaken, gnawing at his sanity like a festering wound. Unable to rest, he decided to visit the crossroads once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something unfinished, that there was a piece of the puzzle he hadn't yet discovered. As he drove down the winding road, the fog began to thicken again, swallowing the light and casting everything in a muted gray haze. When he arrived at the intersection, the place was eerily silent, the air heavy with an oppressive weight that pressed down on his shoulders. He stepped out of the car, feeling a chill creep into his bones as he approached the center of the crossroads. He didn't have to wait long. The fog began to swirl, forming into shapes, twisting and writhing as it took on the semblance of human figures. They stood around him, their hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Among them was Murphy, his gaze as hollow and accusing as ever. "What do you want from me?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Murphy's face twisted, a look of pain crossing his features. "You can't outrun your sins, Elias," he said, his voice echoing through the mist. "You can't hide from what you left behind." Elias took a step back, feeling a sense of dread settle over him. "I did everything I could. I'm at peace with my choices." But Murphy shook his head, a dark smile twisting his lips. "No, Elias, you're far from peace. You carry death with you. You always have." The fog grew thicker, swirling around him, filling his lungs with a stifling weight that made it hard to breathe. The spirits pressed closer, their hands reaching out, clawing at his clothes, his skin, their whispers growing louder until they were a cacophony of voices screaming in his ears. "You'll never be free, Elias," they chanted. "Never free." As the darkness closed in around him, Elias felt himself slipping, his vision fading as the voices grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He clutched his Bible, struggling to find the strength to resist. But it was as if his own sins were binding him, pulling him down into the depths. In a final act of desperation, he lifted his voice in prayer, shouting over the screams, his words breaking through the darkness. "Lord, forgive me," he cried. "Forgive me for what I've done, for what I couldn't change." The darkness pulsed, faltering as his words echoed through the mist. The spirits recoiled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the fog began to lift, the light piercing through the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices fell silent. The crossroads were empty, the fog dissipating into thin air as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. Elias stood alone, his body shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders as the silence settled over him. The darkness was gone, banished at last, leaving only a faint, lingering chill. As he returned to his car, he cast one last glance at the crossroads, half expecting to see the faces of the dead staring back at him. But there was nothing, only the empty road, stretching out into the distance. Elias drove away, the dawn casting a warm glow over the landscape as he left the dark roads behind. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had left a mark on him, a residue that would stay with him forever. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the road, Elias whispered a final prayer, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. For he knew, deep down, that he would never truly escape the darkness that haunted him.